Right, so now that we have had that wonderful introduction to ethics by Peter, so thank you, Peter, I'm going to talk you through some of the practicalities of applying for ethics applications for your research. So I have a question for you all. What do you get if you mix an octopus and a cow? A visit from the ethics committee and immediate removal of funding, which I think may well be something that happens, by the way, if you breach your ethics. I could definitely see funding being taken away, although thankfully that has never happened to us because, of course, we are very conscious about making sure that we adhere to the ethics applications that we put in. Now, I have yet to see any ethics application that proposed this type of study, but this is just a crude way of illustrating why our research needs to be governed and why ethics applications are really important. So you might still be thinking, why do we need ethics applications? I'm not planning to randomly breed an octopus and a cow, so why do we need applications? Why do we need ethics committees? Are they really necessary? Are they just a box ticking exercise? How can I game them to do the research that I want? But that is not the best or the correct mentality. Ethics applications and committees are really important to make sure that you are conducting your research responsibly in a way that will not cause any intentional or even unintentional harm. And they should never, ever be a box ticking exercise. Ultimately, somebody reading your ethics application wants to see that you understand any potential risks of your research, that you have thought about how to mitigate them, and that you are planning to undertake your research in a responsible and safe manner. So what do we mean by ethical research? Well, Peter's just given you a bit of a crash course in that, but ultimately ethical research is research that doesn't cause harm, has a positive impact, and is respectful of the law and individuals' rights, and is above all safe. When research is not conducted responsibly by adhering to these principles, this can lead to dire consequences. So this slide details two famous studies that illustrate unethical research. In the first case, the syphilis study, which involved a deliberate spread of misinformation, which resulted in the further spread of a dangerous disease and ultimately death, when participants were led to believe that they were receiving free treatment, when in fact they were not. And the second experiment was by Facebook, who ran a secret mood study in 2012 without the consent of their users, where they deliberately manipulated their users to see if they could manipulate their emotional state based on the content of their newsfeed. Now, obviously, these are really extreme examples of unethical research, and I'm sure that none of you will be planning these types of experiments. But again, this illustrates why we need governance for our research and why there really should be further government with industry as well. But we need to make sure that we are seeking consent for the data that we collect and use, and we aren't going to cause harm through the actions of our studies, and that if we are spreading misinformation, that is fully justified to the ethics committee for a specific purpose, as sometimes that can be the case, but only in certain instances. So when does ethics apply? Ethics applies when you are doing any sort of study involving human participants, or indeed animals as well, as Peter mentioned. So whether that is collecting their data through the use of surveys, focus groups, or interviews, whether you're using their cells or tissues, their possessions, or asking them to take part in a physical experiment, generally a good guideline here is if it has anything to do with humans, or indeed animals, you will need ethics. There are sometimes cases where you will also require ethics approval to work with past human-generated data. So it isn't just a case of finding out, if it isn't just a case of you're finding out data specifically for your study, if you are, for example, say, going over people's social media information in the past or previous answers to surveys, you might still need ethical approval, and you can talk to your ethics board about that and seek advice. However, unfortunately, ethics applications aren't always that simple to organise. And the amount of potential paperwork involved can seem really daunting if you don't know what you need to do. So I'm just going to take you through submitting an ethics applications and all the types of files that you might need. So how and where do you submit? From an academic perspective, each academic organisation should have an ethics committee and some form of platform for submitting your ethics applications. The University of Southampton uses Ergo, but your university may well use something different. Generally, searching via Google or your university website for your specific ethics board and procedures should bring up the correct links. And if in doubt, ask your professors, as if they're getting involved with research that requires ethics applications, then they should know where to submit them. If you're working for a company, it's really institution dependent. Many of the big companies also do have ethics boards. And generally, if they're working on research, there will be some sort of governance. So you can discuss this with your line manager, what the processes are for your specific company and the type of research you're undertaking. This presentation, however, will focus on what we would broadly expect to see for a general ethics application. And I'm going to be using screenshots and examples from the University of Southampton Ergo system, as that's the one I have access to. But there should be similar forms and questions in each of the different systems. With respect to what to submit, this flowchart was produced for our ethics platform, but I'm showing you because it provides a pretty good guideline for when to submit an ethics application and what sort of information you will need to submit. I appreciate it's quite a small diagram, but the slides will be made available after this. So if you wanted to go through it in more detail, that is feasible. So many ethics platforms will start you off with a submission questionnaire that collects the overall data about your proposed research. The example on this slide is from our Ergo system. This will involve detailing the title of your study, naming all your researchers, your funders, your collaborators, providing details about the types of participants. It might ask you about your data collection and your analysis methods. It will also take you through the common questions such as does your study involve deception, potential harms, dangerous substances, participants under 18, etc. This is to filter through the different types of documents and information the ethics committee will expect to receive alongside your application. There should be guidance from your ethics committee about what documents they would expect for each type of application, like the diagram I just showed you on the previous slide. That is the guidance from our system. Typically then, you will need to submit some form of ethics form. So this slide covers the different bits of information you'll need to provide and the questions you'll need to answer. So you will need to state who your participants are and why you've chosen them. You'll need to detail how you are approaching them and how they can decide to take part in your study. So for example, you might say, I'm going to email them, I've actually got a list of people, or I'm going to talk to them, etc. But also how they can decide to take part. Do they get back in touch with you? Do they fill in a form, etc. You also need to lay out how your study is going to operate, and you'll be asked how it's being funded. So it could be something you're running internally as part of your PhD or part of a university study, or it might be something you're working with external collaborators on in external funding, in which case that needs to be mentioned as well. And also to provide information on any collaborators that you're working with, both from your institution and any external collaborators, particularly where data is going to be shared with those external collaborators. The form will also ask you about whether you're collecting any personal data, which is really important, so personal or sensitive data. So personal data means anything you can identify that can identify you, such as your name, your email address, your signature, and it also covers sensitive, or sometimes referred to as protected characteristics data, so things like your age, your gender, your religion, your ethnicity. You will also be asked some general questions about whether your study involves deliberate deception and what the potential risks are. So the answers to these questions will determine what additional data and forms the board might expect to see from you. Another key document you often need to include is a risk assessment. So it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. If your study is intrusive, deceptive, carries any risk of harm, or includes participants who are minors or who may have diminished capacity to consent, you do need to fill in a risk assessment. That is really important. However, there are also lots of other risks you need to think about and consider. So back in the fun days of face-to-face studies, it used to be common to provide food, which is, quite nice. I used to provide coffee and cake for my focus groups that I ran for my PhD to make them more fun. But even that comes with a risk. So what if one of your participants has a nut allergy and you serve them cake that has been exposed to nuts and haven't asked about that? That is still a risk and something that needs to be considered with mitigation procedures put in place. In this case, I'm going to check very carefully about everyone's allergies, and I'm going to make sure I don't buy anything that has those allergens. Sounds simple, but could still be a real issue. Another risk that people often forget about because it doesn't seem like a real physical risk, but I tend to always, as a precaution, list it as a risk if this is a risk for one of my studies, is the potential for data to be linked and for participants to be identified through those links. So one of the reasons you need to state up front if you're collecting any sensitive data is because the more data you have, like those different protected characteristics, things we talked about, age, gender, ethnicity, religion, etc., the more you could potentially identify someone from that, especially if you're only looking at a specific group of people for the study. So for example, I coordinate the AI3SD network, as you know, and some of you might have seen that we recently sent out an EDI survey as part of the Network of Networks group. Now, in that survey, we are obviously trying to understand how inclusive our networks are. So we have asked for a lot of sensitive information, such as age, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, although obviously we have made it so that participants can choose to impart as much or as little information as they wish, as there's prefer not to say as all the options. But we had to be really careful when we thought about what the potential risks were for that data. And in this instance, if we say release the raw data for the study and you could see a person's full response, depending on how much you knew about them, you might actually be easily able to identify who they are, even if the survey is being conducted anonymously. And then you could potentially find out more information about them than they would have been willing to share with you. So this is why you often need to collate together responses. So rather than sending out full raw responses from participants, you can see aggregate data for each question, potentially with cross-aggregate data if this is relevant to the study and has been deemed low risk. So often risk assessments can be collated with physical risks, but it is really important to consider all of these potential other risks, however minor. And to be honest, this might be overkill, but I do love a bit of documentation. When I submit an ethics application, even if I genuinely cannot think of a risk, I submit a blank risk assessment with my name and the date, just to demonstrate that I have in fact thought all of this through and I don't think there are any, rather than somebody wondering if I might have just forgotten it. So if you are making a risk assessment, you need to fill in a document for this. The table on the slide is from our basic risk assessment. So for a simple risk assessment, you just need to list your risks, think about how severe it is, and then note down what mitigation you're going to put in place, and then what that residual remaining risk is after this. There are also much more complex risk assessments out there. And again, your university should have copies and templates of those, depending on what they want to see from you. But these can involve rating the severity and the likelihood of risk to combine a big score. And then you generally be expected to put further detail in about control steps and also escalation procedures should the risk occur. How complicated your risk assessment needs to be really depends on how complicated the study is. I've yet to do one that was more complicated than this, so it really depends what you're doing for your study. You will also need to provide a participant information sheet. So this sheet should be given to all participants and they should be asked to thoroughly read through it before deciding whether to consent to take part in the study. It should lay out the purpose of the study, how it's going to work, and what you are going to use their data for. You should also explain where they can view the results of the research or where that's going to be posted. And it's really important to explain that their participation is voluntary and how they can withdraw. You also need to lay out the terms of this potential withdrawal, which will really depend on the type of study. So if they're just answering a questionnaire, they can generally just leave without submitting, which means no data is retained. If they're being interviewed by themselves, again, this interview can be terminated and the files can be deleted. Participation that involves multiple parties is quite a bit more complicated. For example, if you're running a focus group that you are recording and someone wishes to leave, they will no longer be on the recording from that point. But if you don't want to delete the recording prior to transcription and analysis, as often then you would lose all the information provided by the other people in the group, then you wouldn't necessarily want to do that. So again, you need to think about what might happen and say what you would do about that in that instance. Similarly, if somebody's actually, consented for you to take some of their cells and tissue, you could destroy this if they ask, but you can't take back the procedure to obtain them or the fact that they were given to you in the first place. And of course, if data is collected anonymously, then it isn't easy to request its removal because you then don't know what it is. So all of this needs to just be laid out for the participants to digest and understand and ask questions about if they need to. So the participant information sheet comes hand in hand with the consent form. Again, all studies using human data should involve said humans consenting to this, or depending on the situation, a parent or guardian consenting on their behalf. There are certain cases where consent can be given verbally or implicitly by proceeding, although to be honest, I would always err on the safe side of obtaining consent explicitly as well. For example, you all had to tick a box saying you consented to the recording policy of this meeting. And when you joined this meeting, you were told that it was being recorded. Technically, therefore, by you choosing to stay, you were implicitly consenting to that. But we also did previously obtain your explicit consent. So I would say your consent form should obtain this explicit consent from each and every participant. And generally, it's a good idea to have multiple consent boxes if you're asking them to consent to several things. So for example, to taking part in the study and answering your questions, to being recorded verbally or visually, etc. If you're doing it in person or you're getting them to actually physically fill it out, then it is important that the document's initialed rather than ticked, and that it is signed and dated by the participant. This makes the forms more credible than something that you could have just ticked off yourself. On the right-hand side of this slide is an example blank consent form for paper usage. However, given COVID, we've obviously been moving to do more and more work online. So online consent forms are also becoming very common in research. And on the left-hand side of this slide is an example of the consent form we used in our latest survey that we did online. And as you can see, we have linked to the participant information sheet as well, so that people can see what's going on. So if you are doing a survey, interview or focus group, then you can get your participants to fill in this form online, or equally you could email them a copy of the consent form and ask them to digitally sign it. So that there's various options, none is right or wrong over the other, but either way, the most important thing is you must obtain consent from every member of the study. If the participants are minors, or if there is some reason why they might have diminished capacity to consent, then a parent or guardian needs to fill out the form on their behalf. So another document that you are very likely to need is a Data Protection Act plan. And I've included an example template from our ethics document templates on the left-hand side of this slide. So if you are collecting or processing any personal or sensitive data, or if your data might be processed outside the UK, then you need a data protection plan. So this is essentially to make sure you are going to protect your participants' data adequately. The data protection plan should lay out an exhaustive list of the data you are collecting, including not just the specific data you are looking to collect, but things like if you're taking voice or video recordings, if you're collecting signatures via forms. You then need to explain why your data is accurate. So, for example, you can ensure, or at least try to ensure accuracy by collecting data directly from the participants. You need to state why the data you're collecting is relevant and not excessive. For example, if you wanted to study something to do with age and gender, you would need to collect both of those pieces of information. But if your study didn't require that information at all, then that would not be relevant and it would be excessive. You need to provide a plan for holding this data securely. So I'm sure that for most of you who are at universities, you should have access to Microsoft OneDrive via your university. And this is set up, and if this is set up in such a way that the data is all held within your university and not on an external server elsewhere, this is generally the best bet, although it is wise to check with your university if this is the case. Otherwise, there should be secure file stores for staff and students to use. Do not put it on Dropbox and do not put it on Google Drive, as that is not EEA compliant and that is very bad. You also need to demonstrate why you are only going to keep it for as long as necessary and how the participants could potentially request their data. So, for example, if you're recording a session to transcribe it and analyze it, state when you are going to delete the recordings, because after all, individuals can be identified by their voices from recordings. So once you have that full transcription that you're happy with, delete them and specify that. There will also be rules in your institution, however, for how long certain types of data needs to be kept. And you need to demonstrate you're going to conform to those rules. So for the University of Southampton, we have to keep relevant research data for up to 10 years. However, this doesn't mean keeping everything. It means keeping enough information that your analysis could be replicated. So for focus groups, you could keep the anonymized transcriptions, but you don't need to keep the recordings that long. You also need to state how participants can get in touch if they want to be sent their data or discuss withdrawing their data, or in the unlikely instance, they need to make any complaints if there are problems. Now, as I mentioned in the risk section, when you have lots of sensitive data about a person, there is the potential for identifying that person. This is why you collate the data together. However, there are other mitigations you can do as well. So say you only have one person with a unique characteristic that takes part in your survey, that person immediately could become identifiable because you know there's only one of them. And if there are things you can do about this. The Office of National Statistics uses a rounding method to minimize the accidental disclosure of personal information. So if there's a very small number for the result, then you can round it to a specific base to avoid very small numbers. And this number is usually 3 or 5. You can also suppress very small numbers. So this is usually done for counts under 3. I would advise really thinking carefully about the data you're collecting. Consider how the links can be made and the potential consequences, and then think about how you are going to address these. You also generally need to lay out a data gathering plan. Now, if you're producing questionnaires, you can simply attach a full copy of that. If you're running a focus group or interview, then listing the types of questions you're going to ask will work. And if you're collecting physical material, then again, a full detailed list of that needs to be provided. If you're running a study that's intrusive, involves the risk of harm or deception, then you must provide a debrief plan. So this should explain the outcomes, detail people qualified to deal with any intrusive parts of the study, and if you're deceiving people, then you need to say why. So in the deception part, this is more likely to relate to medical studies, but you never know. For example, it's very common in clinical trials to provide a placebo for some of the participants and for the rest of them to get the real drug. This is deception, but there is a medical reason for it. So this can be detailed. And finally, some top tips. Firstly, always give yourself more time than you think you need. Remember, you need time to write the application, and the ethics board needs time to review it. And then you might need time to potentially correct any errors or issues. I would advise starting to apply for ethics at least a month before you need it, ideally 6 weeks, just in case. Secondly, double check that all of your forms are consistent and contain all of the required information. If you're submitting as a student, then hold a meeting with your supervisor or project coordinator and get them to check that they are happy, as typically they will be your first port of approval. Don't forget to attach your questionnaires. This is easily done as they don't always immediately come to your mind in your checklist that you might be given. And do a pilot study if possible to iron out any issues. If you have a questionnaire, for example, get a friend to test it and fill it in. And if you're running a focus group and you have some specific goals, do a trial one, see if you can get that kind of discussion flowing that you were aiming for. A really important one is never assume that a study is idiot-proof. Make things as clear and explanatory as possible. If you're running a study in person, take along materials such as pen and paper. Don't assume that everyone attending will just have them, although of course in COVID, maybe it's also wise to take sanitizer and antibacterial wipes alongside those. Or you can email everyone in advance and just make it really clear that they need to do this. And finally, if you are in doubt about whether a form is needed, fill it in and add it, because it can't hurt, but missing it out could make it really difficult to put your application through. So I appreciate there's probably a bit of an information overload. These slides and this talk will be made available via our YouTube channel. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.